Welcome to Obscured Reality with Mark and Stephanie. From UFO sightings to the lost city of Atlantis, from alien encounters to the living dead, each episode will leave you questioning reality. If you're ready to explore the eerie, tune in to Obscured Reality, where mysteries come alive.
That amazing music.
I like it. Catchy tune.
It's not bad, and neither is Obscured Reality. We're back again. Another show. No Stephanie tonight, just Jared and myself. Awesome to have you back. I think we got an exciting or a nice one tonight. Richard Doty. If you're watching the show, you've probably heard of Richard Doty. We're going to go into this. I got some things prepared on this. On this guy, and a lot of Richard Doty has to do with, I think what made his name popular was Paul Bennewitz Jr.
Yeah.
You've all heard that name. Sad story, but we're going to get into it. There's some more stuff in there I didn't really realize. If we get around to it, and we're both wanting to, we might get into something else, which will be next episode anyways, but one, possibly two good ones tonight. So you are clearly familiar with Richard Doty. We've lightly discussed the topic.
And he, for people that don't know him or aren't familiar with him, you want to talk about a master class in misinformation and disinformation, and
big time.
It's hard for me to believe anything or nothing, or he's as far on one side as he is on the other, and I can't tell from time to time to the point where after all of this happened that we'll talk about, he then attended some of these UFO conferences and spoke as a guest speaker, and I am certain that it was for that. He's just one of those people that when you talk to, you have to have in the back of your mind that he's got ulterior motives, or that he's
100%. So
that's the impression I get from him. And then, with what happened with Paul Bennewitz in Kirtland Air Force Base is sad. But whether it was, we'll discuss that. You're going to have to carry most of the load on this, because I know enough to get myself in trouble.
Yeah, which could be good. Let's get into it. We'll get into some opinions afterwards, or at least mine. Yours if you want to share. But let's look into this. Quite a few names are going to come up. We've all heard. So Richard Doty, we're going to start with him. He is a retired master sergeant who worked as a special agent for the AFOSI, or the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. He worked, keywords here, he worked as a counterintelligence and disinformation agent. And I laugh when I say this, just because, knowing the story and what happened, and knowing that this guy is out now as a, air quote, honest person, I cannot not laugh. He may be best known for giving disinformation to Paul Bennewitz and Linda Moulton Howe, and for orchestrating a campaign to discredit Paul Bennewitz. Now, I never knew he had something to do with Linda Moulton Howe here, as far as trying to disinform her, but apparently that's a thing.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah. Former special agent for the U.S. Air Force, Office of Special Investigations, Richard C. Doty claimed that in the 1980s, he was tasked with hoaxing documents and feeding false information to UFO researchers, including Paul Bennewitz. So let's get into Paul Bennewitz here. And this isn't too long. I don't have a ton. I have a feeling we're going to talk for a bit about this. So most of this is going to be pretty quick, which is good. So Paul Frederick Bennewitz Jr., he was born September 29, 1927. He passed away June 23rd, 2003. He was an American businessman and UFO investigator. According to some sources, Bennewitz was the target of a government disinformation campaign that ultimately led to his psychiatric hospitalization. Yeah, not fun. Convinced that he was intercepting electronic communications originating from alien spacecraft located outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, Bennewitz soon believed that he had located a secret alien facility that he called the Dulce Base. On October 14th, 1988, the television broadcast UFO Cover Up Live introduced the stories of, this is also important because this goes into someone else who we're probably going to have to bring up now. That show introduced the stories of the Majestic 12 and Area 51 to the American public. On July 1st, 1989, William Moore claimed that he tried to push Bennewitz into a mental breakdown by feeding him false information about aliens. Now, I'm not certain on how this is being referenced. Is William Moore saying that he himself, Mr. William Moore, tried to do this, or he's claiming that Richard Doty did this? And I say that for a reason, because the documentary I had watched a long time ago with Richard Doty, all sad and upset that he drove this man to death, he was Doty was the one that did it. So I'm not clear on this. But anyways, William Moore claimed that he tried to push Bennewitz into a mental breakdown by feeding him false information about aliens. This was corroborated in a 1992 Monroe Institute article that can be found in the CIA library that claims Moore and another officer of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Richard Doty, are responsible for a disinformation campaign against Bennewitz. Answers my question, both of them. Paul Bennewitz died on June 23rd, 2003. That's all I really need to get into here. The documentary I saw, I don't recall the name, but the documentary I remember seeing was all about Richard Doty and Paul Bennewitz. And here's what I got from the documentary. I recall that I thought Bennewitz had lived fairly close to this base, Air Force Base or whatever, like right across the street.
Yeah, he did.
And I think he could see in like over one of the fences or something. He might have lived like on a second or third story or something. I don't know. And that he was seeing some things, but he was into some type of radio units or something. I don't know, a ham radio or what the deal was, but he was getting communications at some point. Now, I don't know if he was seeing these things and then he contacted the base and they're like, boom, Richard Doty, get on the disinformation trail, campaign trail, and disinform this guy. And then that's how the communication started coming across. I don't know. But ultimately, Doty, at least in the documentary, Doty was the only one I recall being mentioned, drove this guy to basically a mental breakdown. And if I'm not mistaken, didn't he commit suicide, Paul Bennewitz?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Based on after he got out of the, I believe it was after he got out of the psychiatric ward. I think that's right. I think we saw the same documentary.
Most likely.
But Paul Doty, they broke into his house and staged some things in there. And then they also provided him with some documents that basically said, hey, you know what you're onto, you're not wrong. And led him to believe that which is, and I'm not going to be able to add much here, but I do want to say this. This is why in law enforcement, we never, ever go to somebody who has a mental health, 62%, according to PERF, in a study done probably now 10, 15 years ago, 62% of all interactions with law enforcement dealt with a mental health crisis in some way, shape, or form, a mental health patient, somebody that was in the mental health system. And so, but the one thing we've never done, and I say we've never done, we talked about this off air earlier about what they teach you what to do, and then some of the stuff you learn on the streets, after you're out of the FTO program and the academy, you get all your basic foundation there, and then when you get on the street, it's the on-the-job training that helps. But they've always taught us never ever, and you deal with this when you deal with elderly. We'll get people that will be that will call 911 and claim that the aliens are back and they're on the rooftop. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times you show up and they're lonely. They just want somebody. They don't know how
Yeah.
else to. But
And
a
you're
lot,
sitting there stuck talking to him for an hour, even though you got
right.
other stuff to do.
And so
Yeah.
you learn the people that answer those calls that are on that beat learn how to deal with that in a unique way that that leaves them satisfied, whether it's calling a family member to come over, which is usually the case. But the
Yeah.
one thing they tell you not to do is to feed into their delusions. And I will say this: I won't mention any names. They know who they are if they're ever going to watch this. But two very well respected members of our police department and where I used to work, they 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 came in. She was complaining about aliens, about they're 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 shooting beams through her head, and they went in, got some aluminum foil, and put it around um, her head, and they opened up the back
Oh,
door, and one of them ran through the front door and was yelling and screaming and claimed that he scared all of them out the back, and that they locked the back door and they'll never come back. And it worked for that night, but
hmm.
that was a one off. That was more of a funny anecdotal. You never ever give into
Yeah.
somebody's mental health, because you're responsible, i.e. Paul Bennewitz, if they if you leave them, especially when he's going to believe somebody like a Paul Doty that shows up, or Richard Doty that shows up, and he's going to believe what here you have somebody who is a representative of the military, and he's saying, you know what, you're right, and he starts showing them documents or giving him information or planning stuff in his house,
Mm-hmm.
and going along with the psychosis or with the mental health, with whatever the issue is. And from that, when you leave there, now you're responsible for whatever that, if this guy thinks that, well, it's the end of the world like they predicted and offs himself or starts shooting others, or, um, you know, I mean, I won't go as far to say, because it's a stretch, but if you have a cult and they all think that some mothership's coming back to get them, and they all take their own lives, they all commit suicide and think that they're going off in some spaceship, like happened in Southern California years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was Southern California. But that said, this
Yeah.
is why we don't. This is what happens. The bad part of. I mean, there's certainly other disinformation things that are more important. I just wonder what Paul Bennewitz had stumbled onto to make it. Uh, someone had to approve this, and someone had to think this was a good idea.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't recall the specifics, but there was some, I'll say, technology they were working on that was from Paul Bennewitz's point of view in apartment, wherever he was. I want to say he was at least on a second story because he could see over the fencing into this base. He was able to view at times some form of technology, aircraft or whatnot. I don't know. I forgot. It doesn't even really matter. But yes, I would be highly interested to know. But it was of a nature that they didn't want it to be known. So, what's interesting is how they came to the determination that they should waste the time, energy, money, resources on a Richard Doty and one other guy, to spend the time creating fake documents and everything, going to talk to this guy. Like, what could have clued them in prior to starting that little campaign against Paul, um, to think that he may be an easy candidate to pull this disinformation campaign on. My guess is they pulled his address and name and license plates and all that prior and looked him up, and there's probably something in his background there that they were able to find, and yeah, let's screw with this guy. We can do that rather than having to really threaten him, right?
so,
Um,
and I don't know who contacted him, but um, I want to say Paul Benowitz. I want to say the way that Doty got put onto this was, he had contacted two U.S. senators, and they had came to the Air Force Base, basically saying, "Hey, what's going on? We're getting this information." And I don't know if it was before or after, but I know that prompted some of the
Yeah.
things.
I know
Not that what.
Bennewitz.
Go
I
ahead.
know he contacted people, whether it was congressmen or he went to that base directly or whatever the deal was. But yes, you are right. He contacted people on that, and that's definitely where it started.
Yeah, there. So it's from what I'm looking at. It says that two um, U.S. senators, um, that two U.S. senators from New Mexico showed up
Wow.
at Kirtland Air Force Base to check on the investigation of Bennewitz. So that doesn't mean he contacted him. It just means that they were aware of it. Um,
Yeah.
no, well, it does say this. Apparently, Bennewitz sought their help. Um, and both times that he sought their help, the senators told him that there wasn't any investigation going on. And so I guess so now Bennewitz has to be real confused. Uh,
Right.
and the creating hoax documents that were given to him, and it's a similar but a little different than what happened with Linda Moulton. How as her being a journalist and somebody that was writing about this, but I know it was still the same concept.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Paul Bennewitz was also, in some way, shape, or form, a UFO investigator. So there may have already been some stuff out there with him.
Claimed he had
That,
ET contacts.
yeah, that could have been easily found by them to be able to say, okay, get Richard Doty and this other guy on the case and do a disinformation campaign on him. He's probably going to fall for this crap. And that way we can keep this tech that he's actually seeing under wraps and not have him spill the beans on actually really describe what he's seeing. you
It
know?
makes you wonder how many times they've used this before or after when it has been successful.
Mm-hmm.
It
Yep.
has to. I highly doubt that this is the first attempt, because they used it after this. So there had to have been a success with this. And maybe they just didn't, or they underestimated Bennewitz's commitment to this, or his
Yeah.
mental health status at that point, or the deterioration of his being out of touch with reality. And they either didn't assess him correctly, or I don't know what that process is. But I know that we spoke about this on one of the previous podcasts in Iraq. We did this in a very, very smaller, scaled down version of having folders that said or that read top secret on them,
Mm-hmm.
that we would take with us when we were meeting with certain people, and when we would it was used to to give. Sometimes we used it as a status so that we would get people that were more important to talk to us, because if you weren't a general, if your name wasn't, if you weren't one of the top 5 people in Iraq, then they felt like they didn't want to talk to you, and that you were beneath them. And so a lot of times, all it took was something as simple as that. Now, we're not leading them to believe that this was just another way of making them think that it's no different than having the linguist tell them that, hey, this guy answers to the base commander, the landowner, so you need to tell him exactly what's going on, and he'll get it right to him, and little things like that
Yeah.
that are scaled down versions of this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sad because clearly this guy, there's probably some loneliness, some depression going on, and that's, you know, especially nighttime is the worst for that stuff. And he's clearly got nothing else to do. He's looking at this stuff, and not that you shouldn't be, but you need to be of somewhat sound mind and use some common sense. And who knows what's going on, but we see other things come up in here too, like the Dulce base. um I've been hearing about that recently as well. um
Have
on some
you?
video, people talking about that.
There's an individual. I don't know his name. He's famous in the UFO community. He used to give speeches all the time, but he claimed that there was levels to the base and that he got his hand
Yeah.
shot off. I don't know what his name is, but
I think the Dulce base is where there was that alleged little alien war underground between
yeah.
humans and aliens, and
So he claimed that that Delta Force was down there.
Yeah.
Which, when you hear somebody mention Delta Force, you know automatically that they're not, because even in the military, they're referred to as Combat Applications Group or something else. Certainly not Delta Force. Now it's become a lot more common for that, just
Mhm.
as a layman's term. But when he claims that he got into a gunfight, and turns out, when you start digging into it, and it didn't even take somebody digging into it, took somebody who knew, a childhood friend that said he lost his hands. He claimed his father was a part of in a picture, with these aliens that were in this meeting, and they showed the picture, but it turns out this was these were representatives from NATO, and
Hmm.
the guy was an actual representative, an ambassador from Sweden or Switzerland or somewhere like that. That this
Okay.
guy claimed was a one of the tall aliens, and but yeah, his buddy came out and said no, he had his hand. He had his fingers cut off in a logging accident or something like that when he was younger.
Okay.
So they dispelled all of those claims. Of course, when you hear
Yeah.
claims that are so far fetched, we've talked about that. So, but that's
Yep.
where I heard Dulce before.
Yeah.
The one thing I try to go back to is what's practical in with all this, and if it's the Air Force is testing. If we go back to that time, if they're testing new drone capacities and new weapons and new missiles and new technology, and they don't want anybody to know about it, then part of the reason why I say the public doesn't have a right to know everything that goes on, so long as so long as everything that goes on when it comes to research and development, and it comes to testing and technology and things like that. We don't have the right to know everything.
Right.
We don't, we just get into this lot. People don't have a right to drive. That it's a privilege, and so,
Yeah.
and so, as it, you hope that as a U.S. citizen, that when it comes to your being protected, your rights, and your safety and your well-being, that you would know, if there's a gas leak, you expect the government, whether it's a local government or not, to tell you and to notify you to
Mhm.
when they evacuate the area. You don't expect them to say, well, they don't know. They don't need to know. Well, that's something we need to know in the public. And so maybe I wonder if there was something going on to where they were, um, a lot of times it's new vehicles, it's new, whether it's aircraft or it could be anything, but new technology that they're developing, and maybe they realized that they
Yeah.
screwed up by giving this guy too much access, as far as him being too close to the base, and maybe
Well,
they
they
didn't
screwed up.
realize it.
You need to create your own privacy. You're out in public. Now they're not in public, but their base is surrounded by public. So you got to create your own privacy. But to what you're saying, yeah, 100%. Have you heard of the Avro car? Something our military government was working on a long time ago. It's called the Avro car. This is
No,
in the
do tell.
1950s. Okay. Well, before I tell, I'm going to show you exactly what this thing is. You might actually recognize it. Let me pull it up right now. This is the Avro car. What does that look like to you?
Yeah, I did.
It's
Okay,
a
so
flying
the one you're
saucer.
on right now, the just to the right, that one.
Mhm.
I've seen the video where they tried to fly it,
Yes.
or they tried to, and it was just not They couldn't control it enough. That one,
Right
that would
here.
be that one right there.
It sucked.
Yeah,
They didn't get too high. The thing was wobbly as hell. It's
that's
it's
the video I've
essentially a
seen.
hovercraft. Um, but imagine if now this isn't what Paul Bennewitz saw,
Bennewitz saw,
but
right?
imagine if this was that, and you
Yeah,
get someone like him who's deep into UFOs and thinks believes 100% of it, or whatever the deal is. Well, man, you might see that with two people, because this held two people, one on each side, and say, oh my God, this is probably an alien craft, and we figured out a way to build a cutout in there for humans to sit in and try and pilot this thing. You never know. But this is a good example right here of a shitty design, a shitty craft that we thought would be good, cool, something to test, and it turns out it's crap.
Yeah.
I can't. If nobody died in that program, I'd be highly surprised. I mean, that thing was dangerous, man.
I
And
think I think there's a reason they only got a couple feet off the ground, and they cut and
yeah,
from at least the
cut,
video
cut
I
the
saw,
power.
because you get any higher, and yeah, you're going
You're
to
dead.
crash and burn. And
You're gonna flip.
yeah, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to flip over. You're going to land on your head. It's going to kill the pilots or those trying to drive it. And I know what a lot of people are going to say. People are going to say, well, then if it were something like this, why not just explain to Paul Bennewitz, let him see it or show it to him, describe it,
No,
explain it to him. And that's not how the government
you
works. That's
can't.
not how our military works, and that's not how we need to work. And
Yeah.
so we
Fortunately,
don't.
I agree. You can't
Yeah,
tell.
yeah,
Yeah.
you can't, and you can't. No different than because if he's already jumping to conclusions, showing him that number one is probably not going to convince him that it's not going on, and they're just showing me something to appease me, or that's not the
Yeah.
real thing, or but it doesn't explain this, and he's already sold and cemented in his beliefs. Plus,
Hmm.
who else? The first thing he's going to do is pick up the phone and call his brother or brother-in-law
Yep.
or wife or whoever and say, "See,
Yeah.
this is what," and now so that's why we don't do that. And I know that people have said that in the past. Well, if all we're doing out at Area 51 is working on a plane, then why keep it from the public? Well, we know now why we keep it from the
Hmm.
public, and we saw the with all the success we had. I mean, there for a while we thought that the Soviet Union had far much more capacity and capability than they had, until it was our spy planes that figured out they don't have bases and runways full of these different
Hmm.
attack craft, and it's a graveyard out there. There's hardly anything, and that's when we realized that they were. Um, and so it took stuff like this, but yeah, I've heard that before. The public said, "Well, why not just divulge it to why not just tell the public about it? Why, we should know what's going on. It always goes back to we should know what our money goes, our tax-paying dollars are being used for."
Well, that's what
Um,
Congress is for, right?
yeah,
They should know, and they'll keep it secret, but they can, assuming they are 100% working for the people and doing what they're supposed to be doing, and have your best interests for whatever state they represent in mind, then that is how it should be working. You'll never know. They'll know, and can make the judgment calls on the fiscal proportions uh,
and even they don't,
appropriately.
like, there's some line items that are black
Oh,
budget items that
they there's a ton of shit they don't know.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it goes back to what we talked about with some of it when it comes down to, I mean, that's why we have checks and balances and inspector generals and why we have a whistleblower program, so that we hope to cut down on the fraud and the waste and the theft and the because when you have $22 million coming out to go to a Skinwalker Ranch for
Yeah.
research and development, or for studies of everything that we've discussed in the past, then that there needs to be oversight with that. That doesn't need to happen
Yep.
again.
Yep.
And so I just know that getting out in front of it, that's what people will say. Well, if it was just that vehicle, but imagine seeing that vehicle. Imagine if they had got that thing off the ground, 50, 60 feet in the air, and were able to control it up there for an hour, 2 hours. Then you'll know. I mean, the number of and who's to say that wasn't some type of drone, some type of uh, remote piloted vehicle that, we just, there's always, at least the way I approach things, there's always practical explanations. Whether we agree with them or not
Right.
is one thing. And most people won't. Most people don't want to be, they don't want to. They don't want to have their, which is why I try to take this into consideration. Most people don't want to have their beliefs debunked. That when Mick West will tell you that, hey, this was just a glitch, or this was just
A balloon.
a balloon. Yeah, I mean, there's people that swear in Iraq and in Baghdad and in Mosul and some of these places. But until you've been over there and until you see how they celebrate Ramadan
Yep.
and Eid and birthdays and weddings and it's and we for that matter. Uh, we can bring people on that are as a guest that are Iraqi that will tell you the exact same thing that I've discussed this with, and so there's always practical explanations until there's not, and until something happens to where, like I said before, with some things, until Bigfoot shows up at my front door,
Right.
it's going to be hard for me to believe that in our
Yeah.
day and age with our technology and as many people as have cameras, that we don't have anything better than what we do.
Yeah.
And so in this case, I'm glad you pulled that picture up because that's what sent me off on that.
Yeah.
But yeah,
And
the public doesn't have a right to know everything.
yeah, and kind of going with what you just said there, you know, there's usually common sense answer for things. Well, we just heard it in this brief story with Richard Doty here. Something I wanted to point out that I kind of snickered at and did point out. Majestic 12 was mentioned in there. So I want to reread that sentence. It was on October 14th, 1988. Very important right there. 1988. The television broadcast, which was called UFO Cover Up Live, introduced the stories of Majestic 12 and Area 51 to the American public. That's important. Why is that important? Now we're gonna kind of get away from Richard Doty here for a minute, okay? But this is very important. This is very important because of a gentleman who we've talked about recently, named John Lear, whose father was the inventor of the Learjet. John Lear was highly. You want to talk about someone who definitely could be labeled a conspiracy theorist.
Oh
John
yeah.
Lear was that, and he was deep into the whole UFO. UFO is real, right? Unidentified object moving around. But he was deep into alien craft, aliens being here, all this different stuff. Very deep into it. Okay, it's got time and money, and that's all he did. And why do I bring up John Lear? Well, because he was friends with Bob Lazar. Why do I bring that up? Because Bob Lazar's story came out with George Knapp in I believe it was 89. And, here we see Majestic 12 and Area 51 is already coming out in a television broadcast in 1988. So if you got John Lear, who was seeing this stuff about Majestic 12 and Area 51, and he's friends with Bob Lazar, and somehow if they did try to um, perpetrate this story as a false story and it's not real, this kind of answers your questions, or at least leads you down the common sense path of maybe not Bob Lazar, but John Lear. And he's probably the connection in between all of that having to do with Bob Lazar and a lot of that knowledge that came out.
I'm convinced, and in watching this, and I'll go even a step further, and this is my own speculation, but I'm convinced that in that interview with Bob Lazar, where he's sitting in the van and he's blacked out, you just see his silhouette.
Yep.
I'm convinced that he's being told either through his earpiece or somewhere or another from Lear what to say, or he's been given the information as to what to say, but it's been rehearsed before with John Lear as to and if you remember, according to George Knapp, John Lear brought all of these documents in that he wanted him to look at, and it's not beyond him
Mhm.
to have done what we've talked about and given him documents that he's created to make them look real, or
Well,
that Go ahead.
No, keep going. Keep going.
Oh no, I'm just saying that I don't. Um, the more we get into it, the more I feel like that John Lear fed a lot of information to Bob Lazar, and whether Bob Lazar thought this would take off like it did, or it would have the lifespan that it did,
Yeah.
or whether he's too invested now to turn
I
around and
yeah.
admit that it was. But I think Lear had a lot to do with telling him, with explaining to him, with putting the stuff into his head. Um,
I
and
don't think he put shit into his head. I think they did this together. I think this was probably um started with John Lear, but I don't think it took convincing like here let me put this like like talking about Richard Doty and Paul Bennewitz. I don't think it was
oh,
Paul
yeah,
Bennewitz being
I
interested in what's going on in like disinformation. I don't think he was trying to like
right.
lie to him. I think they came up with this and said let's do it.
I think that he was feeding him some of the strategies or the technical things. I don't think Bob Lazar was a victim in that he didn't know or didn't or was reluctant to go along with it. I think he
Right.
thought it would, in his mind, if he's gonna falsify his education record and his work record and all this,
Mhm.
maybe Lear finally
He's the
found
type.
somebody that had somewhat of a contact enough that they could skew it to where he was now all of a sudden at Area 51 at S4 and seeing X, Y, and Z. But like we talked about the first time, how we get from him being a computer tech to that. I think he was
Yeah.
compliant, and
Yep.
I think he was that Bob Lazar thought it was a great idea and went along with it. But I think the brains behind it, or the person steering the ship, was John Lear, because
Yep.
he was having no luck at getting this out. No different than um, the Myers family and Skinwalker Ranch.
Mhm.
This guy's writing and trying to get out these stories, and no one until finally uh, he has a small story that is seen um, by uh, the billionaire that bought the ranch.
Bob
The
Bigelow or Brandon
Yeah,
Fugel.
Bigelow read the article, saw it, and then approached him about buying it, kept him on, and
Right.
so I don't think that Bob Lazar. I don't think that he was a pawn. I don't think that he was. I think he
Oh
was
no.
just as
I
much
think he was as
responsible, and
complicit.
yeah, and complicit, and that's what, and especially after John Lear passes away. I mean, for Bob Lazar to keep this up, and not only that, but to go into the detail that he does,
He knows it by
and
heart. I mean, it's not
yeah,
it's not he doesn't have a difficult story. And
right.
once
Well, it's
you've
not a difficult story. I mean, if you
yeah,
most of it is him claiming, is him
talking about
is
things he
him
knows about
right, and talk and also
makes
talking
it
about
easier.
things that he, I didn't have any, specifying his one avenue and his one small role, but indicating in doing so, I mean, he indicated
Yeah.
that he walked by a room and he looked over and he saw what he thought was an alien, and two individuals that were with him, and he wasn't real sure. And then just dropping these little hints here or there, these
Mhm.
little nuggets of things here or there that make you wonder,
Yep.
how we get from, because we're going so far out there with some of this stuff, and that was my
Right.
issue with what David Grush is saying. Not that people have told him things. It's one thing to say people have told me this. It's another thing. He's all in talking, and if you listen to, he's convinced, and he knows how they travel through space, and how they maneuver, and how and it's just it's tough to watch.
Yeah.
I don't know what the term is now,
Well,
whether but it's difficult to watch. It makes you
yeah.
cringe when you see it.
Well, let me blow your mind for a minute. Some of this you may know, some of it you may not. I don't think you do. I know one piece you do, but kind of on the whole John Lear, Bob Lazar thing, and this is why I am mostly convinced that this whole Bob Lazar story starts with John Lear. Um, so first off, that interview, which this piece I believe you know, I believe we talked about it briefly before. That very first interview George Knapp did with Bob Lazar, where he was just a black silhouette in the news van, with kind of like the desert and a road in the background, with
Yep.
cars driving by. That was
That,
that was at John Lear's house. That was in front of John Lear's house.
and that's
That to
another
me,
reason why I thought that John Lear was feeding them
yep,
information.
that's red flag right there for me. Why wasn't this done at least in the parking lot at the news station? Why wasn't this done in front of Bob Lazar's house? That I can get, because maybe doesn't want to draw the attention, but he could have told them we can do it inside my house, but don't come in the news van. Let's not make it too apparent, or somewhere else. They have the
Yeah, do it
equipment
in
in
a
the
hotel
news van
room.
hotel. They could have just gone a mile out on a dirt road in the desert and done it. There's plenty of possibilities, but here is the real stuff as to why I think John Lear is behind all this. Do you know some of the job history of John Lear? He worked for the CIA. He was a pilot for the CIA. Now, when he was a pilot for the CIA, he was basically just taxiing CIA officials and other officials around. That's what he was doing. No big deal. However, you could possibly come across information there. But more importantly, that led to him being a test pilot at times. And guess where he worked as a test pilot from time to time?
Area
Area
51.
51.
Yeah.
That is drastically important. And here's why I believe that's important. I don't know, and maybe I did mention this to you, but I don't know on the maps at the time that the public had available to us in 88, 89. I don't know if or how places like Groom Lake or Papoose Lake, which is the alleged S4 site from Bob Lazar's story, I don't know how those were shown on there. Were they even shown? If they were shown as dry lake beds accurately, were the names of the lakes there, meaning Groom Lake and Papoose Lake? I don't know. But John Lear worked at Area 51 from time to time as a test pilot for the CIA. Therefore, he was most likely testing planes, test flying planes such as the SR 71. I'm not claiming he did fly the SR 71. I'm using that as an example, though.
Right.
A CIA plane, newly built. He's the man. He's a pilot. He's CIA. Perfect. Now, I mentioned that for a reason, because now he has knowledge on Area 51. Number one. Number two, if he's test flying out of Groom Lake and we know, or Area 51, we know that Nellis test range there is massive. It's the size of a small state. It's huge, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, they have a perfect flight pattern there, and I don't know that they use this as a flight pattern, but I've flown it plenty of times in my simulators and stuff, and it makes total sense, especially if it's a slower plane. There, that whole mountain range, that's the Papoose mountain range that Area 51 or Groom Lake is on. Groom Lake is at the northeast end of that mountain range. Well, about 15 miles south of there, on the southwest side of that mountain range, is Papoose Lake. If he's taken off from Area 51, he's most likely taking off to the south towards Vegas, away from Rachel, right? So we don't have any potential crash landings out on public, because Rachel's not that far as a crow flies, right? Which a plane, a crow, same thing. So they're probably taking off to the south, but regardless of which way they take off, they're landing the opposite way, most likely. You land into the wind, it slows you down, keeps you aloft, you can land slower and smoother, right? That's a perfect 15-mile mountain range to fly south or north, turn around, come around the other side. My point is, John Lear would have known there was another dry lake there. Most likely, John Lear would have had some type of possibly secret, but some type of maps available to use for flying, because some of those planes during testing very well may not have had radios, communications. Who knows? Maybe not functioning electronics yet. Certain necessities, that you can do without, but you do need today. Um, they're going to have charts and maps. We know this as a fact. And was Papoose Lake shown on there with the name Papoose? Even if it wasn't and he didn't know, he's a pilot for the CIA working out of Area 51. He's talking to other people there. Someone else working there easily could have told him the name of that lake, Papoose Lake. What's the bigger picture here? What is my point?
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check back with us often for new episodes. Feel free to drop a comment, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Obscured Reality.